Okay, I'll make a start. Thanks for coming. Good to see everyone. Even though I do this all the time, I'm starting to feel a bit nervous. No, really good to see everyone. Really appreciate it. And a good mixture. I've got students and external people in. Just to put it in context for the external people in, so this is part of Professional Practice Week. So we've got a whole week where we kind of collapse the curriculum and put on different talks, etc., from people from industry, so students can get a sense of, what it's like working in industry and different professions, etc. So, thank you to UWE for asking me to speak here. If you don't know me, I'm a lecturer here, professor here, teach primarily into photography, but teach other areas as well. Hi, Liz. Really, really pleased to be giving this talk. So hopefully I'll be talking for about 45 minutes and then leave some time for questions afterwards. So just to give a flavour of some of the type of work that I do, I've got this self-portrait up here, and I'm kind of interested in visual images. I work in photography and filmmaking primarily, but I'll be talking about that as I go through. But I kind of try to use my visuals to explore ideas and to explore kind of arguments. And I kind of like images that have some kind of tension in them. So if we look at this particular picture, I've got my hair, dreadlocks, which is a sign of kind of African heritage and African identity, wearing a St. George cross, and St. George cross, known for being a national patron saint of England. What I came quite interested in with St. George was away from the kind of dominant arguments of St. George being this nationalist, divisive kind of figure. Actually, St. George is the patron saint of, and I'll pick out Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country that's very close to my heart in relation to lots of different parts of my research. He's patron saint of Russia, Palestine, Rio de Janeiro, Greece, and many other countries in the world. And that's nothing or not always to do with colonialism. Ethiopia's connection with St. George has got nothing to do with colonialism. So rather than being this decisive nationalist figure, actually St. George could be seen to be very opposite to that. A very kind of someone who taps into many different kind of cultures. And I called this image St. George for All. So I'm kind of interested in images that have a bit of a dialogue and what Roland Barthes would call a rhetoric of the image. So that's just to give a bit of a flavour of some of the work that I do as a kind of photographer. But as it's Professional Practice Week, I'll give a bit of background to me and how I got into the place that I'm in today. And I don't take it for granted the fact that I've got kind of the word professor before my name and the word doctor, because that was not destined in my journey. I went to school in Bath, left. These are the grades I pretty much left with. Left school age 15, 16. I left school age 15 and then literally went back just to sit my GCSEs and left again. Didn't even know A-level existed. They didn't tell me sixth form was around the corner. Me and school didn't really gel. So I was actually quite pleased to get out of there. And when I kind of read through my school reports, it's not great. I wasn't like a really bad kid, but I just wasn't engaged. When I was in the first year, actually, I was good and I did get good grades. But then as the years went on, my interest in school just completely plummeted and I just really lost interest. So when you speak to my family about, Shawn works in education, he's a doctor, he's a professor, they're like, really? Do you know what I mean? Because it wasn't something that they ever saw was going to be part of my destiny. But I'll tell you kind of how I kind of turned that around. So when I left school, art was the one thing that I felt I was any good at. It was kind of my gap in the fence, if you like, to kind of make a break. And I was always, even though I wasn't that engaged, I think I was always ambitious. And I was always inspired by art, always making stuff. So at age 16, I went to Bath College and did a foundation in art and design. And so that's a picture of me there. And then after that, I went for an interview in Bristol, which is now part of Bristol College, Ashley Downs site. And I got rejected to do a course in audio-visual design. So after I got rejected, I worked for 2 years, Bath panel beaters was the most racist, toxic environment I've ever worked in. You know, guys just, yeah, it's just a really violently racist place. And I kind of lasted there a year. And then in 1990, I started working, like stripping paint off of furniture. And I just thought, you know, my face over chemicals, I just thought there's got to be more to life than this. And I just got really down. Then that's when I reapplied for college again. So I reapplied for the same college that I got rejected from. I got interviewed by the same lady who rejected me. Her name was Eileen, spiky hair. Always remember what she looked like. And I don't know, she probably didn't remember me, but I think in those 2 years I'd grown more. I'd got more of a sense of purpose and motivation, and she accepted me on that second interview 2 years later. She accepted me. And so that was the BTEC National Diploma in Art and Design at what is now City of Bristol College. But the thing that happened in those interim years when I was doing those jobs was I definitely had more of a sense of my own identity, more of a sense of self. So mid-90s, Soul to Soul, those of you that remember Soul to Soul of a certain vintage in the room, they're a kind of African-centric R&B, hip-hop kind of group. Real sense of kind of black British identity and pride, and it was a real kind of turning point, I think, in black British kind of popular culture. My roots in terms of from Barbados, you know, starting to go there more, connect more with that history, but also crucially Rastafari, getting more connected with that faith, started to embrace that faith and that path, and that was really instrumental with me becoming a confident person. So my work started to be about stuff, rather than just making stuff for the sake of making stuff, which is what I was kind of doing before. My art started to be about things and about ideas and about identity, etc. And I think that's what Eileen saw in me when she re-interviewed me, that my portfolio was just very different. It was a bit more mature, had a bit more that I had to say. So, yeah, I got let on through there. And really, as soon as I kind of got into education, I didn't kind of look back. I thought, right, I'm here now. Try to put those voices of imposter syndrome out of your head, and you just have to work through with confidence. Because at that time, I was slightly older than the other people in the group. Do you know what I mean? Because I'd already been working for 2 years, etc. So I was always 2 years slightly older. And even, you know, I'm being really transparent. Even going to university was a happy accident. So in 1993, it would have been the beginning of 1993, one of my other peers on the course, he said, oh, where are you applying? And I was like, well, no, he said, where are you going? And I was like, what do you mean, where am I going? And he said, for university, where are you going? And I didn't really even think about it. Again, university was not on my radar. You know, growing up in Bath, we had the University of Bath, which was mostly science and engineering. So university just wasn't a thing that I had ever contemplated. So he gave me a proposal, and I started to go down and look for kind of film and photography courses. And I got a place at University of South Wales, what is now University of South Wales. And again, when I got through the door, I just didn't look back. So if you think about my grades from then, which were kind of, and then I got a pass on that course, I got a merit on the course that Eileen let me on, and then by the time I did my BA, I got first, because I was just taking it seriously. Do you know what I mean? I was on it. I was on a mission. I was on a mission to kind of, yeah, really kind of try to think about the landscape of Black British media, representation, politics, all these things I was kind of really fired up by. So just a bit more preamble before I get into the kind of meat of it. But I think this stuff's important, really, because I think when people stand here, particularly on professional practice context, it's just good to know who's talking at you and how they got to where they got to. Because I always think if I'm a professor, then anyone could be a professor, because actually this wasn't destined. I wasn't groomed to be a professor from my infant school. Do you know what I mean? So on the left is some of my education. So that was my BA. And then 4 years or whatever after doing a BA, I went on to do an MA and then eventually started to think about PhD. Before I get into that, I want to look at the middle section, my little bits of work experience. I was working Voice newspaper, I worked at the Arnold Feeney for a while, the Watershed, Black Pyramid Films, which was the first black production company in the Southwest. I worked there when I first graduated, and then from there I went to work for HTV. I'm not going to get into too much detail about the work history, but the turning points are really Black Pyramid Films and HTV Studios, which is basically ITV West. I was a program maker there, making documentaries. And yeah, things came good for me after I graduated. I managed to land on my feet quite quickly, so I'm very thankful for that. And then started to work here 1999, and then came back in 2002. Firstborn Creatives, I need to mention, Rob Mitchell. That's a production company we set up. So things were kind of happening. These are when I started to think about, maybe I could get back into education, do an MA, and then went on to do a PhD. I was kind of drawn on my work experience background to start to inform my thinking of how I wanted to build my career and my research kind of going forward. And not to forget those two references in the green, we've also got personal developments going on. Eldest daughter, born in 2001, youngest 2004, both in the audience today, star seats at the front. I'm really embarrassing them now, I'm milking it. But as you know, when you're in education, whether you're in work, also personal life happens, work stuff happens, bills have to be paid. So there's all these kind of balances that you have to kind of think about as you're building your career and building your kind of direction. So I know I don't want to make this sound like, just so happened to do an MA, just so happened to do a PhD, because those things were hard and they're big decisions that I made. But I just wanted to show that actually getting to this point was by no means destined. Do you know what I mean? There was kind of real kind of graft and sacrifices. So even when I did my MA, I did my MA in London, and it's 1 day a week, part-time at University of London, SOAS, School of Oriental and South African Studies. So I thought, a day a week, that's fine. I was working the rest of the week. But my lecture every Friday was at 9 o'clock every morning. And I had to get a coach at like 5:30 in the morning every Friday to get to Russell Square campus, and I was still one of the earliest students there, because I got there like 7:45 or so, so something's early, when you get up early, you then become one of the earliest ones when you have to travel further. But I stuck it out, and it was kind of worth it. So getting the PhD was absolutely, didn't ever think that was going to happen, but at the same time, if it happened to me, then it could happen to anyone. So these threads I continue to pull on. Me as a writer-director, which was my BA, me as a kind of an artist, if you like, the social anthropology, which I'll be talking about, which was my MA, and then my PhD was looking at participatory practice. So I continue to pull on these threads as and when. So the visual anthropology label comes from my MA and PhD, but it also allows me underneath that umbrella to continue working in these practices of photography, filmmaking, writing, and quite frankly, I can have my cake and eat it. Some mornings I wake up, I'm a filmmaker, sometimes I'm a writer, sometimes a photographer, and I can also join them all together. So I'll be talking about that in terms of the book that I had published last year and how I brought them all together. So in amongst this journey, if you like, and thinking about the politics as well, I started to develop quite emergently this methodology that I call small anthropology. When I studied anthropology at SOAS, one of the things that they were very conscious of is that anthropology as a discipline has a very challenging past. It is in bed with colonialism. If you think about early days of colonialism, when the British Empire and other European empires were going into Africa, going into Asia, and that whole narrative, the anthropologist was there as the wings of the government and also the early wings of academia, justifying and, making sense of those narratives, justifying those narratives, studying the quote-unquote natives, etc., and bringing on a kind of a political kind of science and racism to the narrative. So early anthropology has a very challenging past. But the course was really good because it hit those kind of challenges head on. What I started to explore, and I'm by no means the first one to do this, but we're starting to think about how can anthropology be enacted in a much more equitable way, an ethical way, and a much more participatory way, because also it has some very interesting ideas related to it. So I started to kind of see the way I was working and start to kind of wrestle that into a methodology. And I won't go through all this list kind of laboriously, but it includes things like, as you can see there, trying to flatten the hierarchy between academia and community. Academia is not the sole preserve of knowledge. We go into our, communities, our church halls, our community centres, and people in there have got a whole wealth of knowledge. They are libraries in their own right. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is interview your parents and your friends about things, not just other academics and other kind of experts, quote unquote. Because actually our parents and our people in our neighbourhoods have got wealth of knowledge that we just kind of take for granted. So I'm very interested in that kind of participatory way of working and bringing that into academia, so these spaces aren't seen to be these inaccessible ivory towers. So I'll move on, but if there's any questions about that, I can get into that. So the book that I had published last year draws on the small anthropology approach, and I was looking at black domestic space, black everyday lives and black culture, black British cultures. But I was doing that by looking at objects. One of the mandates or qualities of small anthropology is learning from the everyday and the mundane. And what I'm kind of interested in is how the objects that surround us in everyday life actually have things that can teach us, things that we can learn from, insights that we're not privy to unless we start to dig deeper. Because we just take them for granted. They're in our houses, we don't ask any questions of them. So I'll give a bit of examples as we kind of go through. I was also very conscious that my parents' age, who came over from the West Indies in the early 1960s, what's called the Windrush generation. Many of them are at an age where they're sadly passing on. So again, that knowledge and those wisdoms and those stories are passing on with them. So unless we're engaging with them and asking them those questions, that history's gone. Do you know what I mean? So as social producers and storytellers and creatives, etc., I felt as part of our roles to start to capture those narratives and those voices and document them. So the structure of the book goes through a quintessential domestic space, loosely based on my own family home. I should say my daughter Mahalia made this front cover, and it's based on our family home, and you can see these different objects in the windows. So the structure goes through the house and stops room by room, and then stops on object by object and does a bit of a deep dive into each object, and you get into the social and cultural history of the object. It kind of enlarges the narratives of black history through these objects. And I have to say at the outset, actually, that I'm doing it through my perspective, which is as a black British male. And again, I'm going to keep referring to this. One of the qualities of small anthropology is this one, reflexivity of the researcher. Reflexivity means is that the researcher is letting the reader know who is doing the writing. We're not like, if you think about the sciences, they would say, oh, it doesn't matter who the scientist is because any experiment is objective. But actually in the social sciences, is actually extremely important, who the researchers are. I'd say even in the natural sciences. So the reflexivity as a researcher is me saying, I'm a black male and I'm doing this project, I'm doing this research, and these are my interests. So I'm doing it from that perspective. But a lot of the interests and the stories are actually, they're as much class related as they are race related. There's many of the stories in here where people have said, oh yeah, we had one of those, and I relate to that. And they come from like white working class kind of backgrounds. And I'm very interested in that intersection between race and class. They're not as separate as again, many people would say. So I'm going to just do a bit of a jaunt through some of these, just so you get a bit of a flavour of how I was writing about it and how I was researching it, and also using photography and other practices to go through. So I'll start with the hallway, and these are some of the qualities of small anthropology that was being involved in this bit of the research, learning from the mundane, reflexivity of me, interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, and also narrative fragments. So, learning from the mundane. In the hallway of my mum's house, I got interested in this sign. You know, you've got these souvenirs that are in hallways and stuff. And the top bit said welcome, and then the bottom bit, which is a souvenir, it said, when you come here, what you see here, what you hear here, what we do here, what we say here, when you leave here, let it stay here. And then it says Barbados at the bottom. So when you say the word Barbados, you know it's a souvenir. You know that the poet isn't called Barbados. You just know it's a souvenir that was bought in Barbados. But I got interested in this because it says, you're welcome, but... yeah. There's a bit of a warning. And my mum would have done this thing. I'm not saying that she did this consciously. This is why I'm interested in the mundane. It would be a subconscious thing, but actually, as soon as you open the front door, it's there, right next to you. So I started to just playfully think, okay, yeah, that's interesting. There's a bit of a contradiction there. Let's dig into it and see. And even when I started to think about that, I wasn't necessarily doing it for the research or the book. It's just that we can't turn our brains off. You know, as artists, filmmakers, writers, thinkers, you're thinking all the time about stuff. So I saw this and started to think about it. And then it reminded me of when I was a kid, when I was a child, maybe 10 and 11 or 8 or 9, when I was kind of going out with my friends. And, you know, my mum would always say this to me. I could hear her voice now, do not bring the police to my front door, she'd say. And it's like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? Obviously, don't get in trouble. Don't be an idiot. I was about to swear then, but yeah, don't be an idiot. Don't bring shame on my family. Do you know what I mean? There's so much connotations in this, and it's like a preemptive strike sort of thing. So I started to think about that, actually. Okay, my mum came over in 1962. How old was she then? I think she just turned 18 when she came over from Barbados, alone. Put it in context, yeah? Big sacrifices that Windrush generation made when you're leaving your parents or your family, traveling thousands of miles across the Atlantic alone. And as many of you will know, these are some of the signs that they came up with: no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, that they saw in the windows of many houses. Social housing policies discriminated against race. There's many councils and boroughs in the UK, they had policies that said you can't get social housing unless you lived in the same postcode for the previous 5 years, which already put a ring fence around, if you're not from here, you can't live here. So all of a sudden, then people had to try to find other means, other ways of living and existing. So you had slum landlords that exploited this. They were charging the earth for accommodation in really squalor conditions, 17 people to one room, for example. So people took advantage that actually people needed somewhere to live, but they weren't able to get social housing. What it also did force was that generation were able to buy housing because they just worked their asses off to try to get on the housing ladder, as social housing was often cut off from them. And this idea of entertaining strangers. Maccabee, who is a reggae artist, he's got this record called Invasion, And I'm going to embarrass my partner Julie now because I'm going to sing it. And the verse goes, if a man in your house told you to come out and told you to live in the garden, if it happened to you, tell me what would you do? Will you fight them? So it's this idea that someone comes to your house, you answer the door, and they say, you go and live in the garden, I now live here. That's the analogy of the song. And it's a metaphor for colonialism. Someone's come into your space, and they're telling you you don't live here anymore. And that was the context of Chinua Achebe's Things That Fall Apart, the novel, where it's a notional West African village, and there's missionaries that come into that space and they say, oh, can we build our church? And so the villagers let them build the church, and then the missionaries then also bring in the court, the police, and then within a generation, they're running the space, and the people who let them in are now subject to them, the visitors that they allowed in. And so by the end of the novel, you just sort of see colonialism just happen slowly in front of your eyes, this kind of slow creep. It didn't involve guns, it didn't involve violence, not in terms of invasion, but it was just this slow, entertaining strangers in, and then all of a sudden they've now in charge of the space that you've let them in. There's this slow, and to get really political, you know, this is 1914, what the map looked like in terms of the colonial map and who owned or was in control of what different spaces. So thinking about this quote, do not let the police to my front door, this lies underneath all of that in a really subconscious way. I've worked damn hard to get this house. Do you know what I've been through to get this house? And you're not going to root for me if you're going out doing whatever nonsense with your friends. And on this, so this is the kind of the last page of that first chapter about the hallway, where I kind of go on this meditation journey about this quote and this welcome but phrase, because actually that generation had a huge amount to lose. You know, there's very famous kind of generational divides, and you get generational divides in all cultures, do you know what I mean, where the older generation thinks slightly to younger generation, the younger generation want things to happen a lot faster, and you know, so you always get this generational rifts, and absolutely the generational rifts also happen within Black British communities. But it is taken into account, that, you know, the sacrifices they made to get here and to put the footprint down was huge, but it doesn't always get appreciated. When I took this photograph of Mum, it was during COVID. I was writing a lot of the book during the COVID lockdown times, and it was just a bit of a reflection on during COVID, when people knocked on the door, we were cautious. We weren't just letting people in. There was a hesitance to it. Well, actually, the natural disposition of people otherwise was, oh yeah, come in, get some food and that sort of stuff. So it's just that kind of, I guess it's a kind of a sobering caution, really. So the idea of the front door being this safe haven, being this shield and this guard to the outside world. Outside world often where at school you'd be bullied or whatever. But when you're at home, you know, obviously not everyone has the safety of the home, but hopefully, you know, in constructive family units, there's safety within the home. So that front door becomes that kind of shield, really. But it's not without its politics and its background. So you can get a sense then how the mundane, and you dive in, can really take you on a journey into the unexpected, because when you start digging, I don't really know where I'm going to end up, and it really is that journey of inquiry. So the living room, see here some of the qualities that this relates to. No hierarchy between text, visual and audio. No inherent hierarchy between community and academia. Celebrating and accepting nuance, serendipity, and embracing the unplanned, and also making the method transparent and conflating process with output. So these were just some of the things that was in show. So the photo wall. I was interested in the photo wall as a photographer. I was interested in, photography from a young age. But again, my mum's the kind of the star of a lot of the research. My mum in our household was the photographer. I can't even remember my dad ever picking up a camera. Didn't show any interest. It was my mum. My mum was the curator. She's the one who put this together. She's the one who would put the family albums together. Her day job was a nurse. But I can say, as a pretentious art person, she's the photographer and the curator. She'd be like, what? But for all intents and purposes, she was. And I don't actually have it in this presentation, actually, so maybe I shouldn't talk about it, but I will. There's a photograph that wasn't on here that I was always embarrassed about. You have a photograph of yourself from a kid that you just don't like. And what if you've got a boyfriend or girlfriend, your mum will be showing it to them, and you're like, no, take that away. So there's one that I was always embarrassed by, but I never destroyed it. I just would hide it. But I didn't ever, so I had this kind of innate respect of photographs, even though actually I should have just ripped the thing up and threw it away. But that's actually a different lecture completely. But what I became interested in with this is that there's things on our mantelpieces and on our houses, let alone photographs, that unless we ask the questions of them, we don't actually know anything about. I can guarantee all of you there'll be things that you could point to and say, that's been there since I was a child, but then start to ask the question of where is it from, who's in the picture, whatever, and then actually you start to hit a brick wall because we just haven't asked the questions of them. So I'll just give an example of this. So my friend Nadia Williams, it was her mum's birthday, so she asked me, could I help her recreate these two photographs that have been on her mum's mantelpiece for as long as she can remember, and she would then frame them and give them as a present to her mum for her birthday. So I was like, yeah, fine. So I went to the third floor in Bar Ashton, and we did this photo shoot, and these were the closest recreations we could kind of get to her. So we printed them up and framed them, and she had them. So when I gave her the photographs, I said, okay, when you give her the photograph, also do me a favour, interview your mum about those original photographs, and just find out about them. And she thought I wanted to go with her and interview. I was like, no, just do it on your phone. You just have that conversation. So I gave her some pointers of some things to ask her, and then they had the conversation. So I'll play the, actually I didn't test the audio. Hopefully it comes through the system. I'll play a bit of the audio.
Hello, Mum. Hello, Nadia.
Can you hear that?
What do you remember about the day that you had these photos taken? Where were you?
I was at home.
At home?
Yeah.
And where was that? Where was home?
Anstey Street.
In Bristol?
Yes.
And what was the occasion? Why were you having these photos taken?
I just fancy getting dressed up and having a nice photograph of myself.
Oh. And how old were you?
Yeah, it's low. I'll paraphrase because I should have tested the audio. That's
22.
my fault. So basically, she asked her mum about the photograph, and her mum says, I just wanted to do it to celebrate the occasion of this particular milestone. And then Nadia says, oh, what milestone? What was the occasion? And then she says, oh, I was pregnant with my child. And Nadia says, oh, which child were you pregnant with? And the mum says, you. I was pregnant with you at the time. And Nadia had no idea that she was in her mum's belly at the time these photographs were taken, even though these photographs have always been there in her life. But until she asked, she never asked the question, she would just never have known, and she would never have known that information. And it just gave Nadia a bit of a different sense of her mother. She found out more about her mother in that moment, what her dad was doing at the time, what her mum was doing, what her mum's ambitions were. And it just opened up this conversation of this object that you just take for granted that are in our spaces, but we just don't, and don't bother is the wrong word, it sounds judgmental, but when things are always there, we don't usually ask much of them because they're just there. Do you know what I mean? It's only when we're then thinking more about them, that we kind of want to know more. So this was kind of a lovely little moment, and it speaks to that narrative fragments idea from Small Anthropology. It's just these little moments, these little interventions, using, in this case, photography, which is photo elicitation is the kind of the photography word for it, using a photograph in front of someone to instill a conversation. It's used a lot with people with Alzheimer's and dementia to trigger memory. So photo elicitation then draws out these narratives that are actually just very buried and in danger of never resurfacing. Going into the front room, engaging in narratives of friends and family. A lot of these are kind of, cross-pollinate across. Reflexivity again, privileging intergenerational dialogues, different ages, and also storytelling. So West Indian front rooms are very famous and infamous for souvenirs. If you talk about stereotypes and generalizations, which definitely, admittedly, it is, but some stereotypes and generalizations are very strong and quite factual. And it is a bit of an in-joke amongst many Caribbean communities that the front room was the space where, as a child, you often weren't allowed to go in the front room because it was full of the finest bits of furniture and ornaments that your parents had, that they worked very hard to show off. And it was only usually people like the vicar and the insurance man and people like that were allowed in that space. God forbid you ever break anything, which obviously I did regularly. You get in lots of trouble. So I was never a fan of the front room because it just wasn't a place I could really relax. But my mum had all these ornaments, which, again, as a child, I didn't like. They're just kind of tacky and this, that, and the other. But as starting to think about parents, they're getting older, etc., and starting to reconnect with them in a different way. This is why it speaks to that intergenerational kind of idea. So as a photographer, I started to work with the ornaments. And I put them into this shape. I had this series, and they're called the Adinkra symbol series. So the Adinkra symbols are from Ghana, and there's hundreds of them, and they all have different meanings. This one is the symbol of Denkium, which is a crocodile or a turtle. And so you can see the shape that I've put it in. And this is a huge sculpture. I mean, the bottom of it's here, and the top of it's probably here, and the camera's on the ceiling pointing downwards. So they're sculptures, but they only exist in the photographs. So the meaning of Denkium is about adaptation. It's about a mammal that could exist in the water as well on the land, yeah? And I started to think about these souvenirs that my mum had accumulated over all these years, started to be a symbol of her adaptation from Barbados, age 18, to then, living. She first moved to Leicester, then came to Bath, and, lived in Bath longer than she ever lived in Barbados, and collecting things along the way. Some things from spaces she'd been to, other things there that I know she'd never been to. There's an ornament there from Ghana, and I brought that back when I went there and gave to her. So it's an accumulation of stories through kind of objects. So that's why I kind of think about that in relation to Denkium and adaptation, and started to think, okay, yeah, there's more to these souvenirs and objects. They're not just cluttering up the space. Actually, they are visual stories. They're visual evidence of presence. And I started to do my own version of that, using my own objects. And I did this into the Adinkra symbol of Sankofa. And Sankofa is very well known within the African diaspora because it symbolizes this bird with a beak looking backwards, picking up the seed. And the meaning of Sankofa is going back and fetching that what you have forgotten. So it's about reclaiming, and it often gets equated with reclaiming your culture, reclaiming your identity. So for those of us in the African diaspora, that if you think back to what I was talking about with Soul to Soul and Rasta, when I, went back into education is really important, very formative. So these are some of the objects that I surrounded myself with that had this sense of identity. There's music, there's books, there's pendants, and all these other different things. So this is a self-portrait. I won't go as far to say as this is a self-portrait. My mum would have to say that, but I would go as far to say that this is a bit of a self-portrait of me through objects. But what I started to think about when I was writing this, I made these images before writing the book, but then I brought them back to the book because they were speaking to some of the same ideas. So when I was writing the book, I started to reflect on my objects versus my mum's objects. And I was in my office at home. I started to look around at the objects all around me and the things on the wall. And they were all things like this, things loaded with cultural meaning and identity, yeah? Whereas, things like this, like I wear this pendant all of the time, red, gold and green with an Ethiopian cross on it. They're all stuff that had this kind of signifier. But obviously with my mum's stuff, it's just Edwardian dolls and teacups and very different thing. But rather than try and not be judgmental about that, actually I started to be envious of my mum's objects. And I said I became jealous of the lightness of my mother's unburdened domestic curation policy and unconstrained. So I felt constrained by my own identity and how I was probably limiting things I was surrounding myself with in terms of my interior design choices, etc., because they had to signify blackness and Africanness and identity and rasta. Whereas my mum just saw something, I'll buy that. Do you know what I mean? And it was a very unburdened, whereas my own policy was very self-conscious, because it's like I'm proving my identity. And I think as people in the African diaspora, often we can feel that tussle. What is it that makes me this? And sense of authenticity and these kind of things. And I think, and I share that, I spoke with other people. It's definitely something many of us kind of share, this sense of identity, but also showing your identity, and not hiding it away. And again, that's a difference, I think, in some kind of intergenerational levels. And also start to think about other objects in the space. On the left, you see that cat, and it's lent on a ball, little ceramic cat, and in the weather, the ball changes, the colour changes. So if it's hot, then the ball turns orange, and if it's cold, it turns blue. So it's got some kind of coating on it that the weather changes the temperature. So scientifically, it's really clever. It's also a tacky souvenir from Weymouth. Yeah? On the right is this brass dish. I don't know if it's an ashtray or something. I think I bought it from a charity shop or market or something. So where I live now, the Egyptian brass dish has come with me from my mum's house, but the Weymouth cat hasn't. Do you know what I mean? But actually, I will reclaim the Weymouth cat, and it will come with me, because actually, they're not that different, actually. Maybe what I do in academia, maybe the Weymouth cat reflects me more, because it's to do with ideas and blah, 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 blah. So, but started to really dig into these kind of personal choices about how we surround ourselves with. What objects do we see as having value in our lives and speak to us on a personal level? So moving forward, parents' bedroom, going upstairs. I won't read out all of these, but it then speaks to other kind of qualities in small anthropology. The whole book, by the way, is an autobiographical. I'm just picking on, I just cherry-picked different stories from the book for the lecture. But the book also goes into other people's stories, people that I interviewed, etc., etc. When I became a professor, I thought, I'll mark that with a self-portrait or with a portrait to kind of mark it. And you see the photo wall there. I'm holding a suitcase, which we call a grip. And that's my dad's suitcase that he brought over from Barbados in 1960. And then my mum there, she started to become ill. and you can see her with the oxygen mask on, and she's like, "Oh, shall I take it off?" And I said, "No, no, no. It's part of you. You're beautiful with it. Keep the oxygen mask on, and be proud with who you are," kind of thing. And I called it upon the shoulders, because I wouldn't be where I am without, the people that have given me that support, kind of thing. But interested in, my dad by that point passed away, so he was represented by the suitcase. So thinking about the suitcase is very significant within African Black British culture, and all cultures. Again, this is not just privileged to Black British, but I'm coming at it from that angle. But if you think about people movement and migration, etc., the suitcase is very significant. Wendy Lecoq, she's a photographer in Bristol, and she works for the St. Paul's Darkroom. And when I get to this slide, whenever I do this talk, I always think, I should have invited Wendy. And this is not the first time I've said that. Next time I'll try to invite her. But she does a lot with pinhole cameras. And she's from Birmingham, and she found her grand's suitcase that her grand bought with her from Barbados. But she tells the story, from Jamaica. But she tells the story how she found her grand suitcase when she was younger, before she had kind of a political awareness of Windrush and all these kind of things. She just saw the suitcase, knew it belonged to her gran, and just, I want that, and she just took it. And it has been with her since probably her teenage years. And it was only when she was getting older, learning more about the Windrush, and then she kind of realised the significance that this is my grand suitcase that she brought with her from Jamaica. So she turned the suitcase into a camera. And those of you that know about pinhole photography, she put a tiny pinhole in the side, put photographic paper in it. And when her gran passed away, she was on this bed looking at that point. So this photograph is taken with the suitcase, looking at the same vantage point that her gran would have been looking at, because by that point she was bedbound. So that's actually taken with the suitcase. The image on the right is her mum's suitcase that was also bought from Jamaica. And she's taken her mum's photograph with her grand's photograph. So that's why it's called grip to grip, because it's two suitcases looking at each other. And again, Wendy didn't know her mum's suitcase still existed. It was only when she was doing some digging and then she found out. So for these, again, Wendy using a photographic practice to explore her connection with her, two generations above her, of her mum and her gran, putting in roots in Britain, in Birmingham, but still legacies that exist today. And in Waterloo Station, unveiled 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, the National Windrush Monument by Basil Watson includes suitcases in the design. So you can see here, archetypal West Indian family, stood on the suitcases, and they're holding each other's hands, kind of looking around. It's like the first day of arrival off, we call it the Windrush, but there's many other ships. It is by no means, wasn't even the first ship, but the Windrush is a whole other kind of lecture. But this is kind of the first day of arrival, and you can see here the suitcases being their vantage points. And I talk about in the book the suitcase is not just an object, because the suitcase is like a witness, it's like a co-accomplice with you. It's not just something you carry, actually it's carrying the things that you're carrying, so it's like another passenger. So I call the suitcase quite an active object. Is not just a thing, it's carrying the things that are actually really important to you. But I also talk about this sculpture in relation to what it reminded me of, this painting by Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, that was in, what year is this? 1818. And it's kind of seen to be a very romantic image that's talking about expansion and discovery of the quote-unquote new worlds, etc. So you see this figure stood on the rocks, quite confidently looking out at the vast expanse of the mountains and the clouds, etc., at the sea of fog. But the stance is actually quite, I'm ready for you, I'm coming. And he's by himself, where the stance of the three people in the sculpture they're holding on to each other, they're leaning into each other, they're looking up, and they're more tentative than the Caspar David Friedrich figure. So I was kind of interested in that tentativeness. Quite rightly, my good friend Valda, we had a conversation about suitcases, and actually there is a challenge about the idea of suitcases in Black British art, because it could also be felt to be kind of not holding us back, but freezing us in that moment, and always bringing back to this kind of Windrush moment, when actually, you know, we're not defined by that Windrush kind of identity. So yeah, there's some interesting kind of conversations around there. So that's just a potted history through, or potted kind of look. I'm not going to talk about the Dutch part, but I want to talk about the context, because chapter 9, when I knew I was going to write this book, I didn't know that I was going to talk about the Dutch part, because it's a very significant object within Caribbean culture, very kind of iconic. You know, there's lots of Caribbean restaurants called the Dutch pot, and it's a very particular thing. So when I was writing the rest of the chapters, I thought, oh, chapter 9 is going to be easy to write, because Dutch pot is really well known. And when I started to do the research into Dutch pot, I got pretty much a blank page. There was hardly anything. And the only things written on Dutch pot were like blog articles, but not really academic studies about Dutch pot and the history of the Dutch pot and all that sort of stuff. I was really shocked. I was like, no, this can't be the case. There must be more out there. So I started to do more research, and then finding out that the European equivalent of the Dutch pot is the Dutch oven. And when you start to research the Dutch oven, thousands of academic studies about the Dutch oven. Like, couldn't get enough of it, yeah? And it really showed me that actually whose stories aren't being told, whose stories aren't being documented. And it's a really stark example of not even just erasure, just lack of presence. Not even, it's just so stark that putting the European name for it and the conversations about the Dutch oven in the European countries, huge amounts. But again, the Dutch pot and the Caribbean equivalent, even though it's well known amongst us, actually what's been documented and published out there is a complete gap and a complete silence. So the book kind of explored that. Also, I had an exhibition around it last year in Bournemouth, and it was a whole exhibition that looked at, it was called Small Anthropologies, and it included many of those aspects of the book and the stories and the photographs, and there was also film, etc. So that was incredible. There's a whole story there about but seeing it come alive, book's one thing, but again, Small Anthropology is about celebrating the, different mediums. It's not just about the text, it's also about the enlarged narratives that you can explore through photography and film. So yeah, I will end it there. But any questions, feel free. But thank you very much for listening.
I have a question.
Cool. Yeah, go for it.
What was the connection between St. George and Ethiopia?
Yeah, good question. So St. George is a patron saint of Ethiopia, because there, in Ethiopia, you're going to regret answering this question. Don't go on too long. Ethiopia is the second oldest Christian country in existence. First one's Armenia, second one's Ethiopia. Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity predates Catholicism by about 150 years. So when you see Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, some aspects can look like Catholicism, but actually it predates that. Catholicism copied or whatever. So there's a whole narrative there. So their relationship with the saints predates England by centuries. Do you know what I mean? So that's the short answer. So St. George had St. George a long time before any other European country adopted St. George as their patron saint. So that's the short answer. It's an interesting one. I mean, I'm not going to profess to be the font of all knowledge about St. George. A lot of the narratives, though, are quite similar in terms of the motifs. When you see the symbol of St. George slaying the dragon, it's exactly the same. So there's a famous painting in Ethiopia dated from 1896. And 1896 was what's called the Battle of Adwa. So Italy tried to conquer Ethiopia in 1896. And everyone expected Italy to win that because, in terms of, technologies, etc., Italy had the much more advanced warfare, but actually Ethiopia completely defeated the Italians in 1896. And when you see these famous tapestries, every single one of them, you see the Ethiopians on the left-hand side with Emperor Menelik, Empress Tetu, and they were the emperor and empresses at the time, and then the Ethiopian forces, and on the right-hand side you see the Italian forces, they had cannons, the Ethiopians just had spears, but above it you always see in a rainbow a figure on a white horse with a spear, and that's St. George. And in every single painting of the Battle of Adwa, and it's a very famous kind of motif in Ethiopia, you see, because they carried the flag of St. George, so they attribute their victory to St. George, because he was the one fighting the dragon. Yeah, and it should be known that Ethiopia is the only African country that was never colonized. Liberia, people talk about Liberia, but that was slightly American. But every other country in Africa was colonized, but Ethiopia remained independent and still remains independent. So St. George has those qualities that actually it helped them fight the dragon, essentially. Yeah. It's in the library. It's in the library, yeah. And it's also, I think, if you search deep enough in the UWE library, you can also find the PDF version as well. Yeah. It's on Amazon and online, yeah. It's mostly, because it's Routledge, they don't put it in bookshops, which is I'm very sad about. But it's not. But yeah, you can buy it like W. Smith, Waterstones, online. It's everywhere. But yeah, it's in most academic libraries. It's definitely in our library. And I have to say, once I became a geek, when I got to Newport and I was like, yeah, I'm a student now, I became a real geek. And in 1992, I definitely remember thinking, I'd love to write a book for Amazon. That was my bucket list thing. Sorry, not for Amazon, for Routledge. So when I wrote that was actually a tick off my nerdy bucket list that I wrote a book for Routledge, really. There was a question here, yeah.
As a Black British, what's your approach toward the slavery activities in the UK, and what do you think this generation or the future generation should approach? Like how you should look at history?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question because a big part of my research has been about transatlantic slavery. I've done a lot of research about Bristol's connection with transatlantic slavery and Bath as well. Bath always got away with it. Bristol took the heat because this is where the work happened and this is where the ship sailed from. And Bath was always in the shadows. So I did a lot of research about talking about the connections with slavery in Bath. And yeah, I think it's a very important history that shouldn't be forgotten. And I don't see transatlantic slavery history as black history. It's just history. It's more British history than it is black history. And when it comes to Black History Month, and then when I see events about slavery, it's like, hang on a minute, we can't be defined by that. Do you know what I mean? Because we need to talk about that all the time. But anyway, that's getting slightly off the point. But I don't think it's something that should be forgotten. It's really important that we know as much about slavery as we do about Henry VIII and, English Elizabeth I. It's a part of the gradation of British history and it shouldn't be forgotten, really. And I think the challenge with slavery narratives is that people think it's uncomfortable. People start to, should I be feeling guilty? It's like, well, no. Do you know what I mean? Just learn about it. It's not your fault, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't learn about it. Do you know what I mean? So history isn't always comfortable. That doesn't mean it should be learned. Yeah. All right.
When choosing a symbol to portray on was you chose change. Why exactly did you do that? And then you chose something.
Which symbol, sorry?
Your symbol for change, the little turtle. Why did
Oh.
you choose that to personify your mum and your work?
Oh, it's because of adaptation. That particular one. So I just find it. There's one before that. So yeah, the symbol, so each distinguished symbol has this meaning and a bit of a narrative to attach to it. So, you know, it's a project that I was kind of chipping away at over the years, and I've got other ones as well. But I think it's just one of these things that you just start to join dots. Do you know what I mean? So I think I started to think about. I'm not sure what came first. I'm not sure if I wanted to do the turtle first and then think about what objects. I think it would have been the other way around. And I think I probably thought, oh yeah, I want to do something with the souvenirs, and what could I make it work with? And then I think that's when I started to think about the adaptation and how souvenirs fit with this idea of adaptation, and you know, and moving from space to space and adapting to different climates and different people, different cultures. So it seemed to fit with that. You know, I've got another one that I made called Wawa Abba, the symbol is. And the Wawa Abba is like a circle with a line down it and sort of hooks that go off the top of the circle. And it symbolises the Wawa seed. So the Wawa seed, I think, is a mythical seed, but it's meant to be like a really tough seed, that it symbolises someone that's really kind of tough and heroic and stuff like that. So I made that for my brother. My brother was always the hero in my eyes, do you know what I mean? And he was strong, he, you know, taught kung fu and fitness and all that sort of stuff, but he died of an illness back in 2013. And, you know, he went from being that strong person to a person that had all these vulnerabilities, you know. So just before the funeral, I cut off I used to have really long dreadlocks, so I cut them off. And it was about 2 years later, you know, that I actually thought, oh, I want to do something for my brother. So I made the Wawa seed out of my hair, and I put them into the symbol of the hair, and that was a tribute to my brother. So it's very, you know, it's not very, I don't come at those projects with thinking, yeah, I've got to do this, I've got to do this. They just come at me, then I just end up making it, what's the word? Intuitively, I suppose. It's not overthought. It's not overthought. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. Hello.
Hi. Just thinking about what you were sort of saying in the beginning around like the front door, the threshold, and the kind of the sort of sacred, the history behind the sort of the sacred space of the home. And it made me sort of think about in relation to sort of the objects, just how a lot of these objects we accrue are like from our ancestors.
Yeah.
Handed down.
Yeah.
And there's something quite sort of spiritual about that.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that something that you kind of thought about in terms of, just that these objects are do have a kind of spiritual aspect to them in terms of our lineage, I suppose?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think they do. They get loaded with meaning and attachment and idea, even myth. And sometimes we don't even know why, you know, but we just know that, okay, yeah, this object, you know, I just can't lose it because it belonged to my mum or my gran, or, you know, it's like, why do we go to museums to see a particular object, you know, Nefertiti's head or whatever it is, or the tomb, or, you know, we go there to see the object. If we then find out it's 3D printed and it's just a very good replication, you know, would we suddenly feel cheated? What are we getting from seeing the real, authentic thing? Do you know what I mean? I'm always kind of interested in that. So yeah, we've all got things, I think, that we just, you know, we just know that it's just got a story attached. There's a meaning behind it that we can't quite articulate, but it's just important, and we would be kind of devastated if it gone, you know. And I also think that in relation to photographs, because photographs are often the thing, and I've probably shown my age, because it's a very generational thing, But in relation to the analogy of the burning down house, people say, oh yeah, I'd grab the photo albums, you know, but it's probably a certain generation that say that. It's not really, you know, younger generations won't say photographs anymore because they exist in the cloud, wherever the cloud is, do you know what I mean? But I think our generations is often, again, talking very generalistically, but that was often the stereotype thing that people say they would grab would be the photo albums because they were the thing that you couldn't ever replace, you know. So yeah, I think different people have got different examples of it, but yeah, I think the spiritual aspect of objects is really crucial, definitely. Yeah. I love these questions.
Are you going to write another book?
Yeah, thank you. I'm meant to be. My next book is, I mean, it's going to be on small anthropology, but I don't know whether to, I'm still on the cusp of whether to just write a book about small anthropology methodology or to write it about another topic that uses small anthropology. Do you know what I mean? I've been kind of asked to write about small anthropology methodology, just get it out there. This is what this is. But I'm just, yeah, I think I'd find it more interesting if I attach a topic to it rather than just about the methodology itself. Do you know what I mean? So, I don't know, what do you think?
Something really interesting about it, you know, like if you write a book, it's like a marathon. It's this quite rational process.
Yeah,
you know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah.
Like deep thinking, deep research takes bloody ages.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Whereas I love the way you talk about these, just like they just come from your sort of subconscious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just inspired to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, you're definitely more fun. And and it probably says a lot about me and my restless brain, but this book can be read in any order. It's not a read at the beginning and you have to get to the end. Every chapter is completely its own universe. Do you know what I mean? And you don't need to have read one chapter to understand the next. And I think that's probably, I mean, you know, I wrote a PhD of 80,000 words that had to be beginning, middle and end. I'm not sure if I could do that now. Do you know what I mean? I'm not sure if my attention span could stand that anymore. But I think this was, I like this fragmented way, which is also why one of the qualities of small anthropology is fragmented narratives. Because yeah, I think it has a lot to say about actually just the small, the bite size. Things don't always have to be this big, grand, that epic. Do you know what I mean? We just learn things from small things. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be over egged. You know, when it gets to the end, that's the end of that story. Do you know what I mean? So yeah. I should also mention that chapter 5, the armchair, that's purely fictional. And I was interested in putting my money where its mouth is, because one of the qualities of small anthropology, again, it's about interdisciplinarity and recognizing the different disciplines, or, you know, music teaches us a lot. We learn a lot from music, we learn a lot from TV, we learn a lot from films, we learn a lot from music videos. Again, the textbook isn't the apex of knowledge. So thanks for coming, Liz. See you soon. All right.
I'll give you a shout.
Yeah, definitely. Bye. So chapter 5, I wrote the armchair, but it's a fictional character that goes through a fictional thing. Chapter 14, teenage bedroom. That's just photographs. It's a photo montage of posters and objects and different knickknacks, because I couldn't think about one archetypal, stereotypical object that can define the teenage bedroom, because that is the time when you're exploring different things, you're experimenting, do you know what I mean? So the photo essay is, you know, skull and crossbones, bootleg tie, adamant poster, you know, it's just random collection, because actually that is our teenage years often, you know, we don't know what we're kind of. So yeah, there's different styles of writing and presentation in the book as well. And yeah, Routledge didn't fight it. I thought that I would have a fight on my hands, saying I want to write an academic book where a whole chapter is fiction, and they were like, no, you get it, because you've justified it. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. Any other questions at all? But thank you, really, yeah, great questions. Thanks for listening and entertaining and indulging me. And yeah, I guess in terms of anthropology, you know, it isn't the colonial endeavour that it used to be. And many people who were, if you say, the subject of anthropology are now doing the anthropology. Do you know what I mean? And I'm very much interested in the anthropology of everyday life. It's not about going to some far off land, the exotic, how it was in the 1800s. It's about anthropology everywhere, you know, because we've all got stories. So, yeah, tell your own stories, really. I'll end it there. So, thank you very much.